War Beneath the Roots is a fantasy fiction podcast. While rooted in tabletop storytelling, this is a fully written narrative crafted for audio. Video versions are available to enhance the experience with maps and art, but they're not necessary. This podcast contains violence and themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. She led them to the grove. Moss wept down black-barked trees. Dark roots rose like ribs from the earth. The people formed a ring, robes stitched with bone, jars hanging from chains, full of captured voices. One by one, the jars uncorked, the air filled with screams, whispers, sobs, every note bending toward a single chorus. They crowned her in bark and bone, called her the Bloom's Mouth, offered their blood. She watched as they carved old glyphs into their chests, chanting in tongues they didn't understand. Spores curled up from the loam. Mouths widened too far. Eyes sank into pits. They convulsed in reverence. One by one they fell, twitching, gasping, changing. Skin sloughed. Thought fled. They stood again, empty. She stood at the center. No one touched her. No spore took root. Why? A slow breath behind her eyes. Not words, just contentment. She looked at the bodies, now swaying like trees in windless air. Is this what they wanted? It felt right. She knelt, fingers sinking into the soil. That tree from this old grove, the one from her dream. It was gone, uprooted, a hole in its stead. She whispered, "Closer?" The corpses, the jars, the forest itself replied, "We bleed the stone, so it may bloom. The roots will feast, then we shall die. Broken flesh makes way for new order." I am Benjamin Harris. Welcome to War Beneath the Roots. Chapter 11. The morning broke gray over Aneydon, light bleeding slow through slate-colored clouds across churned mud and wooden docks. The village was already alive, boots in mud, carts creaking under crates of salted meat, and rough-wrapped weapons, soldiers shouting over breakfast fires. Markin tightened the last buckle on his pack outside the salty ore. Blue chewed on a strip of jerky nearby, looking more annoyed than hungry, and Beam stood still as a carving, his mossy limbs misted from the damp air. They were just beginning toward the northern gate when an energetic clap echoed behind them.
"Ah, intrepid pathfinders, embarking upon the sylvan hinterlands, are we not?"
A wiry woman bounded into their circle, short black hair bouncing with every step. She wore a beige overcoat streaked with earth, its pockets bulging with curious vials and clipped notes. Her bright eyes glittered with excitement, and she moved with a jittery grace, as if gravity itself were a suggestion. Her left arm, from shoulder to fingertip, was a lattice work of brass and silver, clockwork joints ticking softly. Tiny runes etched along its length, pulsing faintly with light. It moved as fluidly as the flesh it replaced, but with a precision that betrayed its arcane mechanical heart.
"I'm Dr. Korek,"
she announced, thrusting out a hand to each of them in rapid succession. Too rapid for proper etiquette, but hard to refuse.
"Ethnobotanist, proto-mechanical savant, and autodidactic alchemist extraordinaire. I've been quantifying and cataloging the Bloom's mycelial propagation ever since I survived. Your vector is northerly?"
Blue raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Beam released a soft swirl of comforting spores. welcome, curious. Markin nodded.
We're looking for my sister. She passed through here on her way to the Medi outpost 2 weeks ago.
Korik laughed, a bright, high-pitched squeak.
Splendid! I shall endeavor not to impinge upon your operational tempo. My experimental apparatus awaits nighttime deployment at our encampments, but, if agreeable, I would be most gratified to procure biological specimens, she said, glancing longingly at Beam.
Beam's spores drifted closer, intrigued. Blue exhaled around a mouthful of jerky. Markin offered a tight smile.
We'll need all the help we can get. Is the bloom really here?
Korik's grin sobered.
Indeed, the bloom's biotic infiltration has metastasized across this landmass. I possess insights, but my research requires continuity. All my implements are already cart-bound, primed for mobilization.
Markin slung his bow over his shoulder and took a steadying breath of salty air.
We've got rations for 2 weeks, but...
Korik giggled, a bright chime in the morning air.
Fear not my victual needs. I carry sufficient rations and have devised supplementary foraging protocols en route.
Markin arched a brow, impressed.
Lead the way.
Blue exchanged a glance with Beam, then fell in step as roots brushed a soft trail in the dirt. The road north wound into a cathedral of oaks and beech trees. Pale sunlight sifted through veins of leaves, painting the mossy floor in shifting emerald shards. Fallen trunks lay draped in lichen. The air tasted of wet bark and early sap. Somewhere overhead, a hawk's cry split the hush. Markin's horse moved carefully between gnarled roots, quiver thumping against his back. Blue drove the 2-horse cart beside him. Beam settled in the cart's rear beside Dr. Korik, spores drifting like lanterns in his wake. Dr. Korik bounded through conversation while taking samples of Beam's spores and fungi.
You see this? Fagus grandifolia, Quercus alba, temperate dominance, ideal for my sporadic assays. In southern Midborg, we see almost exclusively acacia.
She paused, tapping her stained overcoat with her mechanical arm.
I'm uninfected. Most succumb within 12 hours to the rot's neurotropic cascade. I've tested small-scale antifungal elixirs that eradicate local colonies. Cured one subject who'd barely begun the transformation, still ambulatory, if mentally strained.
Blue grunted, spores pulsed from Beam. Interest. Hope. Markin glanced at Korik.
You actually saved someone?
Her grin wavered into fierce pride.
Imagine reversing a death sentence, fragment by fragment. But I shall require fresh specimens, spores, hyphal mats, infected sap. Enough to titrate a systemic inoculation.
A shaft of light caught her vials, suspended like trapped dew.
With proper provisioning, acidic solvents, distilled water, reactive catalysts, I believe I can synthesize a bloom-neutralizing compound.
Markin exhaled.
Then we'll gather samples wherever we find it, and stop whoever brought this plague here. As I mentioned, she said, adjusting a strap on her overstuffed satchel, I hail from Midborg, a land of raw, unrefined folk, yes, but not malevolent. Pragmatism wrapped in bearskin. They ferried the bloom to these shores not as saboteurs, but as survivors, fleeing annihilation. They believed, fervently I might add, that this central landmass, the spine of the continent, was uniquely hostile to the bloom.
She spun a vial absently between her fingers, her voice speeding up.
Old tribal myths, some predating cartography, spoke of these lands as hallowed or immune. Where the world's fire sleeps, they'd say. The bloom, they believed, would die here. It would unravel, a sanctuary by nature's own hand.
Her smile faltered for a beat.
It was an inadvertent miscalculation, a beautiful theory, undone by brutal mechanics. The bloom adapts, it learns, and belief, no matter how old, offers no resistance.
Markin's shoulders stiffened. He stared at the trail ahead, horse hooves crunching wet leaves.
They carried it here, believing it would die. All that hope.
Blue's great frame sat atop the front of the cart. Just moved their coffins. We find Cassandra. Then all this is someone else's fight. Beam's spores drifted in a steady pulse. Pity. Sympathy. Compassion. Dr. Corrick's bright gaze flickered between them. She bit her lip.
Indubitably. Locating this Medi outpost is paramount,
she chirped, fingers dancing through the air as though conjuring molecules.
I possess a suite of bioactive sporic inhibitors and phylotoxic conjugates capable of arresting mycelial proliferation, and even reversing the earliest necroblight lesions in creatures. Yet my assays remain preliminary. I require additional biomass, further specimens, if you will, to optimize my formulations.
The road north narrowed to a rutted ribbon, through ancient oaks whose trunks wore gray lichen. Streams stretched beyond the tree line. Each dawn the party pressed onward, sunburned faces hollow with dust and effort. In the evenings, Dr. Corrick would talk to anyone who would listen about her chemicals and samples as she'd set up her lab and attempt multiple experiments before they would quietly take their watches. On the 5th morning, they crested a low hill to find Wadhurst's broad fields of barley, pale and whispering in the wind, squat stone fences making up several pig farms, and fields of grain. The air smelled of rotten eggs, wet timber, and yeast. At the rusty Rudder Inn, its beams hung thick with dried hops. They swapped their horses for fresh mounts and warmed stiff legs over steaming stew. The locals warned the group that heading north would take them outside of Malcia's lands, into the independent towns and cities of the central landmass. Beyond Wadhurst, the forest thinned to rolling pasture. The path wound past tinkling brooks, where fishermen stood silent in waders, nets full of silver trout, staring at the group for signs of hostility. At dusk on the 2nd day, they entered Guildbutton, beneath a sky of slender towers, each capped with a gilded cog that twirled in the breeze. The low wall around the city bore the sigils of 7 crafting guilds, each ward with its own watch. As twilight fell, enormous stone gongs in the center clanged themselves to mark the smith's guard, then the weavers, then the alchemist. Street lanterns shifted from emerald to amber to indigo, signaling which trade held sway. They paused at the Ticking Flask Tavern, its door still steaming from last night's brews. A drunken clocksmith boasted of a ruined northern gate carved with runes older than Malcian lore, found deep within the woodlands. He slammed a brass fist on the table and growled, "Could foreshadow trouble, if you're the sort who reads omens." Under Guildbutton's shifting lantern light, they slipped through narrow alleys toward the ruined gate the clocksmith had spoken of. Even the air here felt charged, tinged with charcoal dust and the copper bite of machinery. A half-moon cast sharp shadows across the weathered stone. The old northern gate stood cracked in two, its ancient runes faded by time. Dr. Corrick crouched before a smear of black lichen, creeping through the glyphs.
"Remarkable," she muttered, quivering as she lifted a glass vial. "Early bloom residue, undeniable."
Her trembling mechanical fingers scraped at the wall. Beam spores drifted around his bark like living lanterns, flared bright, then snapped back inside, recoiling as if the very residue shoved against them. On the smooth stone, the lichen itself shivered, curling away from his presence in sudden retreat. A pulse of alarm flitted across his silent form. Blue loomed behind them, muscles tensed at Beam's reaction, when a soft click echoed off the stones. Markin's bowstring twanged. His arrow buried itself in rotten wood as a hidden door swung inward. 2 Alchemist Guild wardens, in bright indigo tabards, spilled into the moonlight, lanterns held high.
"Outsiders!"
one spat, flask hanging from his belt.
"Trespassing on property wards!"
Their eyes flicked to Corrick's vial and Beam's bioluminescent spores. Dr. Corrick sprang up, voice rushing like a creek in a flood.
I'm merely..."
she began, but the taller warden advanced, baton raised. Beam spores pulsed. Protective. Furious. In a swirl of green mist, vines erupted from the cracked flagstone in anger, unlike Beam. a response to the Bloom's Tate. The vines bound the nearest warden's ankles, yanking him off balance, away from the Bloom lichen backward through the hidden doorway. Blue charged, horn lowered, sending the second tumbling into his companion. Markin dashed forward, shoving a crate into the doorway. In the chaotic glow, Dr. Korik snatched a second sample, this one a tiny bulb of luminescent mold, and jammed it into her coat pocket.
My apologies, she panted, but science compels me.
The two wardens, freed by an impatient kick from Blue, blinked over the wooden crate at the retreating party. Korik clutching her vials like treasure, Beam's spores settled in hesitant circles. Curious, guarded, eager. They regrouped beneath the gilded cog tower, hearts pounding. Markin slid an arrow back into his quiver.
That could have gone worse.
Blue flexed aching muscles and cracked a grin. A little light trespass never hurt anyone.
Dr. Korik's eyes gleamed. On the contrary, it yielded invaluable specimens. I dare say our next campfire will be far more illuminating.
Beam's spores drifted in tight spirals. Satisfaction, relief, and a spark of excitement. Their small victory at the gate spoke of both promise and peril. Ahead lay Fenverden, and answers breathed from marble lips that murmur secrets at twilight. Chapter 12. The morning sun burned through the haze as they left Guild Button's stout walls behind. The Brewers' Guild held sway this time of day, every cart heaped with kegs, men and women tending to hop vines that wound their way up lampposts in hopeful green spirals. Farmhands waved to the carts, many bound for Malcia's front lines, the air thick with yeast and barley. Markin urged his mount forward, rein slack in one hand as he looked back to the creaking cart behind him. Blue's broad shoulders heaved against the shafts. Dr. Korik crouched in the back beside Beam, who sat still as a fallen log with spores drifting around them. The road soon narrowed beneath ancient oaks again. Beyond the last hop-laden tavern, the forest closed in. Lichen-draped branches brushed their shoulders, and moss-muffled paths wound upward toward the highlands, each breeze carrying different smells, many flowers and trees in full bloom. Korik peered around at the others.
Fenverden's statues, locally reputed to be carved from marble so exceptionally unadulterated it retains, fragments of their sculptor's soul. At twilight, the relics engage in vocal emissions, utterances of knowledge, or so the folklore insists.
She clicked a vial against her coat with a smirk.
Admittedly unverifiable, but hypothetically advantageous.
Blue snorted. Talking stone? He glanced over his shoulder. You believe that, Beam? Beam's spores pulsed. Gentle curiosity. Markin shook his head.
If Cassandra's been there, maybe they'll tell us something.
Korik tucked a lock of black hair behind her ear.
Marble is remarkably porous. It may hold organic particulates. I'll initiate a quick assay when we arrive. The material I collected in Wadhurst indicated preliminary stage bloom. One hopes Fenverden yields a more progressive stage, ripe for analysis.
Markin's brow furrowed.
We need to get Cassandra and get out of here before any of that happens.
Dr. Korik convinced the group to set up camp early that evening. By the time the firelight trembled across their faces, she'd been working hard at her experiments, mumbling to herself for hours. Markin stirred the embers with a stick, steam rising from the pot of thin broth. Blue sat nearby, back against a log, one great hand resting on the haft of his axe. Beam knelt a little further from the fire's edge, spores drifting out in silent pulses, roots firmly engaged with the ground. Dr. Korik crouched on the opposite side, unpacking more glass vials and steel probes from a battered leather case. She spoke to herself in clipped, hurried phrases as she mixed a viscous sample of bloom residue, collected from Wadhurst's stone near the gate, into a shallow, polished dish.
What we have here, she murmured, is a phytogenic transmission axis. diffusion at a rate of an order of magnitude slower than zoogenic vectors. So to say, plants spread the blooms slower than animals.
She dripped a second sample, Beam's bioluminescent spores, onto the edge of the dish. Instantly the spores recoiled, forming a shimmering halo around the black ooze. Markin leaned in.
It's like magnets.
Corac's dark eyes glittered.
Precisely. A repulsive field. Then watch.
She tapped the dish with a glass rod. The halo ruptured. Beam's spores surged inward, and the bloom residue disintegrated into a soft hiss, as though unwinding from itself. Within seconds, no trace remained. Blue's hornveins flared with silent astonishment. Beam's spores pulsed bright, gleeful, triumphant. Corac exhaled, voice unsteady.
Reactive annihilation. The spores destabilized the bloom's mycelial lattice. Complete obliteration. I've never witnessed such efficacy.
She scooped the cleared dish, eyes alight.
If this scales, we're looking at a curative delivery vector. If we can harvest enough spores.
Markin watched Beam's quiet glow. The druid's magic, feared as corruption, might be their greatest weapon against the bloom's advance. He met Blue's gaze and nodded once. The night pressed in, dark and deep, but around the fire their small circle burned brighter with purpose and hope. The group settled in around the fire, taking their watches in turn. The forest beyond the fire crackled with unseen life, but nothing crossed the tree line. Sleep came, thin and dreamless. Something shifted. Markin awoke abruptly, lungs burning, choking on spores. Terror widened his eyes as he gasped for breath, his body frozen between sleep and panic. Across the fire, Blue clutched his throat in a silent struggle, eyes wild and straining. Realization hit them at the same time. It was Beam. Beam spores were jolting them awake. Markin was barely on his feet, his leather armor beside his bedroll, when he heard the first snort echo from the underbrush, low, gruff, and raspy. The firelight trembled across the road as a massive dire boar burst from the brush, an easy 10 feet in length. Its bristles thick with fungus and mud, tusks curved like sickles. Behind it 5 more charged, eyes alight with hungry, red fury. Markin knelt, pulled an arrow from his resting quiver, and lifted his bow. He took no time to aim, but watched as his arrow buried itself in the lead boar's shoulder. But the beast barely staggered. The creature slammed into the wagon, spokes shattering beneath its bulk. Splinters flew. Markin stumbled in a circle, keeping the breaking wagon between himself and the dire boar. Blue roared and charged forward, axe swinging. He cleaved into the flank of another boar. Meat and fungus split in a fountain of black spores. The boar spun, gore dripping from its jaws, and slammed Blue in the ribs with the side of its head. Blue grunted, staggered back, the wind knocked out of him. Beam advanced, spores hissing from his bark. He pressed knotted roots into the dirt. The ground shuddered as black tendrils whipped up, snaring a third boar's legs. It howled, claws shredding earth, tearing root, only slowing its charge. Beam's spores pulsed. Disgust. Urgency. And with a flick of his wrist sent a cloud of blistering spores at its face. His spores balked, pausing between the boar and himself.
Alkaline decasynth compound,
Dr. Corac shouted, hurling a bottle that shattered at a boar's snout. A hiss of chemical steam rose as tusk and snout dissolved into gristle, the inside of its face and teeth fully exposed. Another boar charged her, and she pivoted, producing a vial of gel. Black shards of glass exploded on impact as the reagents began bubbling and expanding down the boar's back. It reeled back, only anger in its eyes, crashing into its fellows. One of the beasts bore down on Blue's side, tusks lowered, aimed for his waist. In that instant, the golden, ghostly dome flared into being around Blue, a whisper of light that split the tusks apart and forced the beast's jaw upward. Blue blinked, chest heaving, as the boar flew up and over, landing on its face the other side of him. Markin's heart thundered. He'd willed it. The shield had sprung from his will, instinctual and unbidden. Beam's spores, hanging in the air where they'd been for a few moments, suddenly shot forth, surrounding the dire boar. Flesh bubbled, the boar screeched, eyes and squeal twisting into panic as it collapsed. Realizing the beasts were sensitive to Beam's spores and Dr. Korek's compounds, the party regrouped. Markin yelled, "That one! They're following that one!" He loosed arrows at the boar's bristled neck, each shot weakening its charge little by little. Beam unleashed a torrent of phosphorescent spores, lighting the clearing in sickly green, the boar's shrieks high and panicked. Blue charged the boar, axe raised, tusks snapping just beyond his reach. Dr. Korek had braided together the two different tinctures again and tossed the combined bottles into the massive boar. It erupted in violet smoke, the boar convulsing as its joints seized and front shoulder melted, the reagents once again spreading backward across the boar's body. It reared to gore Blue, only to find itself suspended mid-charge, slowed in time, Markin's hands extended. He whispered, "Blue, now!" Blue split its skull in two, the blade biting deep. The boar collapsed with a final gurgling snort, its fungal rot seeping into the earth. The remaining boars charged in a panic, crumpling quickly under the combined onslaught. Beam's roots crushed ribs like brittle stalks. Dr. Korek's acids ate through hide, and Markin's arrows found their vital targets. Silence settled, broken only by a single wet gasp. The boar that endured Beam's spores still breathed, barely, but its fungal plates had dissolved, leaving raw, uninfected flesh behind. Dr. Korek scampered forward, vials and quill rattling in her metallic hand, feverishly collecting samples and scribbling notes. Lanterns flickered over the gore-slick road and shattered glass. Spores drifted skyward in faint spirals. Blue leaned on his axe. He met Markin's eyes, gratitude and awe. "So, a wizard now?" Markin's legs trembled. He touched his chest as if the spell had carved a memory into his ribs. "I did that," he murmured. Beam's spores pulsed. Pride, relief, something gentler. He knelt by the wounded boar and released his spores. Dr. Korek looked up, eyes alight. "Incredible! The mutual repulsion, then total collapse. I've never seen." She dabbed at notes, eyes sparkling. The boar's wounds began stitching closed. It settled into slow, even breaths. It did not rise. Beam's spores pulsed. Calming. Protective. Friend. As the moon dipped toward dawn, the group settled in for what little rest they could find. Beam remained rooted, resting beside the sleeping boar. Dawn's pale fingers found them as the first light crept through the trees. The place where the boar had slept was empty, the shattered cart's one remaining wheel slack in its axle. Markin vaulted onto his waiting mare, her flanks glossy, muscles coiled. Dr. Korek swung up onto one of the horses they'd used to pull the cart, overcoat tails fluttering. Blue spent some time building a sled from the broken cart, gathering what he assumed was important materials and equipment Dr. Korek had brought. With a low groan of bark and bone, Beam's form began shifting. Limbs lengthened into sinewy legs, roots coiling into fetlocks. In seconds, where the druid had been, a great warhorse stood, its coat mottled, green and brown, spores drifting like embers from its mane. Blue's broad shoulders sagged. He eyed the steed as if it might bite. "Come on," Markin called. "It's meant for you." Blue hesitated, gently hammering his gauntleted fists against his thigh. At last, with reluctance that shook the morning mist, he attached his makeshift sled and saddle from the other cart horse and climbed up. Beam huffed, shifting his bulk under the weight and too small saddle. His spores pulsed. Encouragement. They set off, hoofbeats soft on the dirt road, 3 very different-sized horses in tandem. After a few hours, Court glanced up at Blue, voice bubbling with curiosity. "You and, Beam, how did you two meet?" Blue's eyes flicked to the back of Beam's equine head as they rode. He drew a long, considering breath. Beam's spores drifted closer, patient, expectant. Blue's grip tightened on the saddle horn, shoulders tensing with memory. "I was once the great dragon's ward," Blue began. "Olathontor, a worm older than some kingdoms, bound me with a magic bracer of sapphire and steel. His treasure lay hidden in a fey-forged labyrinth, a maze of living crystal and moonlit vines. For many years I stood sentinel at its heart, sworn to slay any who dared claim his hoard." He shook his head, eyes distant. "A few months back, a band of 50, maybe 60 fools, adventurers including this here druid," he patted Beam on the shoulder, "bore into the maze. Vines strangled their torches. The crystal beasts and plants bled them. Many died, many got lost. But about 20 of them reached the vault. A powerful group, like nothing I've seen before. They struck Olathontor himself." Blue's jaw clenched. He was immense, winged storm and burning sapphire eyes. The bracer flared, slashing my soul. I was compelled to cleave them, but this druid cast a torrent of spores that burned through my bonds. The bracer shattered. My mind snapped free. A hollow chuckle escaped him. I turned on the dragon. Together we all drove him back through corridors of crying stone. He fled, rending the air with fury. We stole what we could carry and fled the labyrinth, treasure in hand. He exhaled, horn veins dimming a cracked blue glow. "Since then, I've carried that grudge, and this druid beside me, hunting him across every road, every river, every shadowed wood." Beam's spores drifted close in a steady pulse. Pride, loyalty, and a strong bond. Markin's eyes glimmered in the dawn light. Dr. Corrick leaned forward, reaching over to pat Beam's mane. "And by your own hand you severed the restraint. Remarkable. One can only conjecture the dragon's mind now, his former instrument, now an autonomous adversary. Delightful." Blue merely nodded, posture still tense with promise and pain. The road ahead stretched into the midday sun. They rode in silence, broken only by the clink of glass in Dr. Corrick's satchels and the creak of old leather. Birds fell quiet the further they traveled. Even Beam's spores, usually dancing in lazy spirals, hovered close, watchful. A day and a half passed beneath waning skies. Then, as the sun dipped behind a shelf of distant clouds, the land rose, and the statues came into view. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each carved in stillness, their faces half turned as if listening. Marble pale as stone, streaked with age, eyes hollow, mouths open, waiting. Markin slowed his horse. Wind whispered between the figures, and for just a moment he thought one of them moved. Only a shadow, he hoped. Seeing no one outside on the small town's dirt roads, they made camp just outside of town, stone sentinels watching, the silence thicker than their sleep. Thanks for listening to War Beneath the Roots. If you enjoyed this story so far, consider following or subscribing and leaving a review. Until next time, keep your blade sharp and your fire burning.